Before we move on to the last module, let's look at this new context in which a science journalist need to work. First, let's remember that science journalists create new information by connecting science with events and their context. Science journalists report on science, but by taking into account the health, political, economic, sociological, cultural, and religious concerns of their audience. And vice versa, science journalists report on their audience's health, taking into account what science says about health. And this is well explained and researched by Hans-Peter Peters. I invite you to look at Hans-Peter Peters in the bibliography. Since science journalists have always connected the context with the science that they report, this evolving context is a main concern to them. Now they have to increasingly take into account a growing heterogeneity of groups within society. And there is a diminishing authority of science and medicine. There is this strong attraction of alternative therapies like naturopathy, homeopathy, and chiropractic. And there is a growing autonomy of patients. Added to that, mistrust of big pharma and governments, and the vigor and quasi-religious aura of many anti-vaccines activists and claims. This is a more complicated environment for a science journalist. Professor Paul Bramadat, Professor of Religious Studies and History at Victoria University in Canada, has written that because of this evolution transforming democracies, we may be witnessing conditions for a perfect storm in public health, a perfect storm that could have tremendous consequences for those who cannot be vaccinated. The vaccine controversy calls for a science journalism that covers these interactions between the science of vaccination and the different social, cultural, and religious values of people. This intersection of science and values creates a new challenging environment for science journalism. In the next few slides, we describe risk acceptability as an illustration of the importance of taking into account the facts and the values. This slide is mainly to be read at leisure, but it explains the difference between the mathematics of risk assessment, which is simply the product of the potential amount of harm that an adverse event could cause, multiplied by the probability that it will occur. This is mathematics, risk assessment. But for people, when they look at risk, they take into account how the risk and the benefits are distributed. If they see someone else benefiting and themselves perceive that they are the ones absorbing the risk, they will look at risk in a different way. And then there is the risk that you take voluntarily compared to the risk that you cannot control. Also, people perceive risk differently according to the risk agency. Fighting nature is something more easily acceptable than being potentially harmed by something that a fellow human being does to you. And to that should be added the risk to the vulnerable. However small, the potential risk to babies and children will be extremely important for a mother and a father. And finally, all these factors can be influenced by variable levels of trust in the government and in regulatory bodies. The next module is the last one, and it will propose a way for science journalists to cover public scientific controversies.